Thank you, everybody, for joining today. As Jonathan said, I am Principal Product Marketing Manager for Premiere Pro here at Adobe, but fun fact, I'm also a Sundance alum. I had a film that I produced, a documentary in the festival in 2009. So I am even more excited to be part of this conversation and to introduce you to our panelists. Today, we're not only going to be talking to filmmakers who've had their films in the festival, but also to the topic of how the Sundance Film Festival is programmed and the way that the festival is built. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our panelists. First, we have Sam Fader, who is the director of Disclosure, which premiered in the festival in 2020. Cited by IndieWire as an exciting trans filmmaker shaking up Hollywood, Sam's work explores the power dynamics and politics of media-driven identity, connecting urgent issues in the trans community to the struggles of the past. The Advocate, named Sam's feature, Kate Bernstein is a Queer and Pleasant Danger, one of the best LGBT documentaries of 2014. Fader's work has been supported by the Ford Foundation, Fork Films, the Jerome Foundation, the McDowell Colony, and Yaddo. Sam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Megan.
Next,
it's great to see you again.
Yeah. Great to see you again as well. Next, we have Amy Scholder, who is the producer of Disclosure. Amy is a leader in the independent publishing and LGBT activism. She produces events, conferences, and festivals, and has been managing imprints in the nonprofit and independent publishing worlds for over 2 decades. She currently serves as president of the board of directors for Lambda Literary. Disclosure is her first producing credit. Congratulations for that, Amy, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Hi, Megan.
Next, we have Christopher Makoto Yogi, who is the director, editor, and writer for I Was a Simple Man, which premiered in this year's festival. Yogi is an artist and filmmaker from Honolulu, Hawaii. His debut feature film, the award-winning August at Ikiko's, had its world premiere at the International Film Festival of Rotterdam in 2018 to critical acclaim. Richard Brody and The New Yorker named it one of the best films of 2019. I Was a Simple Man is his second feature film, which has participated in the Sundance Screenwriters and Directors Lab, IFP Film Week, Film Independence Fast Track, Sundance Catalyst, and received a Jerome Foundation and CineReach grant. Chris's short films include the documentaries Occasionally, I Saw Glimpses of Hawaii, and Makoto, or Honesty, and the fiction film Obake, which means ghosts. Chris is a Berlinale Talents, Visual Communications Armed with a Camera, Kyoto Filmmakers Lab, and New York Film Festival Artists Academy Fellow. Welcome, Christopher. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Delicia Barrera, who is the film and series programmer for the Sundance Film Festival. For over a decade, Dilcia has worked for film festivals, including a tenure as programming director for LIFF, senior programmer at AFI Fest, and has collaborated with programming teams at Outfest and the Los Angeles Film Festivals. Most recently, she was LACMA's film curator and was invited to curate 2 short categories for the New York Film Festival. She was featured in IndieWire's 20 Latin Americans Making a Difference for American Independent Film Today in 2016, and Screen Daily's Future Leaders 2019 Programmers and Curators to Watch list. Thank you so much for being here with us, Dilcia. Okay, so let's get started. I'd love to start out, obviously a lot of the attendees at the panel here today are young people who are aspiring to be filmmakers. So I'd love to start off with each of you giving a little bit about what inspired you to get into filmmaking, film programming. And Sam, why don't we start with you?
Why'd you have to start with me? Wow. Well, gosh. I think when I was 15 years old, I was taking photos. I had gotten the Pentax K1000, which was like very, very manual and camera. There was nothing auto about it. Went to B&H Photo with my dad and bought it for a class I was going to take. And it was only taking black and white photos. And at the same time, Magic Johnson came out as HIV positive. And a mentor of mine in high school was obsessed with him. And so she immediately organized a group of us around around the movement, around the HIV movement, around the AIDS movement. And so I immediately became politicized in my storytelling and saw the connections between how the media was documenting the AIDS crisis and how it was so stigmatized through that documentation. And I started creating my own stories about people living with AIDS. And also at that time, I was exposed to authors like James Baldwin. So the lens of race, class, and gender were just deeply embedded into my little 15-year-old brain from the start. And one photo essay I did at that time was for my like senior thesis, and it was about Black and brown gay men who are adopting kids who are born positive, and just the implications of all of that, like, who's adopting, who's allowed to adopt. There were so many issues to be explored in that story. So anyway, that's kind of where I got interested in storytelling through images. And I feel like as I kind of came up in the world and just became more and more politicized, and activism was more the root of all my inspiration, filmmaking just kind of paired with that really well. As an introverted activist, like, this was a really great outlet to deal with the issues I was interested in. And I think it was around in my early 20s that I started, I got the PC1, the Sony PC1, again from B&H Photo, that tiny, tiny digital mini DV with the little tapes, which now apparently college kids haven't seen yet. And that little eject button where you hear the door open and you're scared, you're breaking the tape every time. And so that was my first digital camera in 2000 maybe. And then from there I was telling stories about trans people. That's kind of how I got my start.
And how about you, Christopher?
Oh, geez. I think growing up, I was studying writing. I thought I would grow up to be a writer of some kind. I studied poetry, creative writing in college, but I always loved movies. So similar to Sam, I got my first camera, which is a mini DV camera, and I was just playing around. Like, I would shoot skate videos. I was a skater at the time. I would shoot parties, and then over the weekend, I would just spend my time like teaching myself how to edit, and just playing around, putting music, just having fun. No sort of pressure on myself. But I found out that I just loved it. Like, I could spend just days just playing with footage and putting it together. And then I had a couple friends who were also into filmmaking, and I would start just shooting stuff with them. And I love the collaborative aspect of the whole thing. I loved being with other people. I loved just having fun. And so I decided that at that time I would try to pursue filmmaking. I didn't know anyone who's a filmmaker. I grew up in Honolulu, Hawaii, which we didn't even really have independent cinemas. It was really only like the multiplexes. But when I was in college, I was introduced to Asian art cinema through our library. Basically, I just went to the library and watched a ton of Asian art films, and I was just so inspired by the way in which they told stories about their home, about their land, about their history in a way that was artful, beautiful, and moving. And so once I was introduced to that, I was like, oh, that's what I want to do. It's like poetry, but it's honest to their place, and I want to do something like that, but based in my home, Hawaii. And so that's sort of what I've been striving for ever since.
Wonderful. And how about you, Amy?
Oh, well, my road to making Disclosure is different. Since this is my first film, I had a long career in book publishing and started off as a very young person at City Lights Books in San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which had in the 1950s, when it began, really been founded on an idea of free expression and lifting the voices of underrepresented communities. When I came in there in the 80s, my community was LGBTQ. My community was beginning to be ravaged by the AIDS epidemic, and I also formed community in San Francisco with artists, visual artists, performers, and my specialty kind of became making books with people who told stories in unconventional ways. And fast forward many, many years later, when I met Sam, who had just made this film about Kate Bornstein, who I adore and whose books I've published. And I heard about Disclosure. I felt a kind of calling to become part of the making of this film, and so appreciated Sam's work that I'd seen up to that point, and realized that this made so much sense for the kind of unconventional career that I'd had, where there'd really not been a single path, but really been informed by my activism and politics.
And Dilcia, what was your path to where you are today?
I think last year I would have said a different answer, but this year during quarantine, I dug up my old yearbook and found a memory that I completely forgot. I was in high school, I was the president of the Creative Writing Club, where I had coffee nights every Friday, and I invited people to read poems and play music, and I put up their art, and I commissioned artists to make my posters. So I realized for over 20 years, I've been making spaces for artists. I've been creating opportunities for people to express themselves. And I didn't connect my my upbringing and my education to what I do until this year, finding that memory. But really, to me, what's important is storytelling. I am Mexican American, so storytelling is really important in our culture, but I didn't realize my passion for cinema until college, when I found that that was something you can study, that it's a technical, there's people behind it. There was a connection, because everything in my life really should have, according to the way I was raised, should have led to being an accountant or a doctor or something way more. So it really, to me, is a natural progression to being a programmer and figuring out how to give voices to filmmakers and artists all over the world.
It's interesting across all of you that really like creative expression sort of started in a different discipline, whether it was creative writing or photography, and has sort of evolved into film, which is interesting to me only because as I look at sort of the next generation of filmmakers, filmmaking has become so much more accessible and is almost sort of the first go-to creative expression now, which is wonderful. And it'll be so interesting to sort of see how that evolves over the next 20, 30 years. I recognize that maybe not all of the attendees here today have seen either of your films. So I'd love, Sam, if you could actually just start by giving a little background of the subject matter of Disclosure, so the panelists sort of know what we're talking about here.
Sure.
Or, excuse me, the attendees know what we're talking about, not the panelists.
Oh, the panel too, you never know. Disclosure is about essentially the history of transgender representation in Hollywood and film. But what it really does is look at this moment we're in now, these past 5-6 years, where there's been an emergence of trans visibility and a celebration, while there's also been an increase of social and legislative violence. And so it's putting that history in that context, not only to understand some of the reasons why we're experiencing some of this violence, like to understand the roots of a lot of the distorted images and ideologies that people have about us, but also to think about how can a social justice movement better prepare for that moment when they're put in the spotlight and then backlash will ensue. And the film is also geared to take people through their own personal history, and in a nostalgic way to take them back in time when they were a kid watching TV up into the present and revisiting these clips. And we're finding in real time that when people watch Disclosure, the growth is happening, because they're now seeing the films in a different way through a trans lens, because it's 30 trans people on screen that are guiding you through this 100 years of.
Yeah, I definitely felt that as I watched it, that it was sort of your own peeling back of like, oh geez, I hadn't even recognized that this was problematic, or I hadn't even thought about this as like something that I need to be thinking of from a different lens. So success. Yeah. And Christopher, how about you? Can you explain a little bit about I Was a Simple Man?
Yeah, I Was a Simple Man is a fiction film. It's a film that's basically just born out of my love of my home, Hawaii. And I, for the past, I want to say 10, 15 years, what I've been doing is just trying to tell stories that feel very lived in and honest to my experience growing up born and raised in Hawaii. So this particular film was experienced by my experience of death in the family. About 10 years ago, I went to a period in my life where I was experienced like a really disorienting period where I experienced 3 deaths right in a row. My father passed away from cancer. My grandfather committed suicide, and then another grandfather died of cancer. And it was just a time when I was just I didn't really have the tools to deal with what was going on. I was very confused. And I remember being in in that final grandfather, I remember entering his room when he was sick. And I remember being there while he was essentially unrecognizable and on the verge of passing away, and just being very terrified and confused. And yet he was talking to people who weren't there. He was shouting phrases in Japanese that I couldn't understand. And so it really felt like his life was like closing in on the room. And it was just a terrifying and yet in retrospect quite beautiful and profound thing to be a witness to. And so I Was a Simple Man is a film that really just tried to capture that feeling of being in the room with someone who's passing away, that sort of haunting yet beautiful feeling. And it tells the story of an old Japanese man who's living in the countryside of Hawaii and who's on his deathbed, and he's visited by the ghosts of his past. And his family comes and takes care of him. And through that, we get to know his life over the 20th century, and we sort of get glimpses of his life over the 20th century in Hawaii. And so it's a film that's very much inspired by that experience, but also stories of my family that I've collected over the years, and just my way of, telling a story of the islands that's honest to my experience of it.
And as your bio demonstrates, this isn't your first film. You have had a number of projects before this. Why was now the time that this story needed to be told, that you decided to dive into these family stories?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like I said, I came up with the idea 10 years ago. And I made a short film called Obake, which Japanese word for ghosts. I thought I was done with the idea. I thought that was it, but for whatever reason, the character stayed with me, and I couldn't. I think I was still, now that I look at it, I think I was still processing a lot of that. I was still mourning. I wasn't really confronting what I had gone through, and so it just stayed with me. And so about 2014, I sat down and I decided, you know what, I'm gonna try and write this as a feature. It just vomited out of me. It was just like super some kind of weird catharsis, and it felt good, and I liked it. And that initial rough draft was accepted to the Sundance Screenwriter Lab. And so since that was around 2015, and since then it's just been the long haul of trying to get an indie film made. I wanted that to be my first feature, but it was just so tough to make. And at the time, an Asian American film wasn't really that. Nobody really wanted to see an Asian American film about an old man who's dying. And so it was a hard sell, I think, for a lot of folks. So it was a lot of no's. And it just has been 7 years of just trying to get people to see the vision and see what this film can bring to the world.
I think that's such an important point to be made in this forum, because I think, I went to film school, and I feel like when I looked at people who were, succeeding and, premiering at Sundance, my assumption was they finished this amazing film and they submitted and they got in, and then everything was, roses, and their careers were launched. And there really is like a trials and tribulations behind being an independent filmmaker that isn't often demonstrated or talked about as much. So I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah.